The Indian Act of Canada was made in 1876. It gave the Canadian government almost complete control over the Aboriginal people. It was made to assimilate Aboriginal people into the Canadian culture. It forced them onto land reserved for them. Native peoples could not earn a university degree or become a doctor or a lawyer and still be considered status Indians that are eligible for benefits under the Indian Act. Many Native children were sent to residential schools, which were often located a long way from their homes. These schools were often run by Christian organizations that believed that Native children had to be saved by becoming Christians. The children were not allowed to use their own language or to practice any of their beliefs. Sometimes they were even abused. Our next event takes place in World War I. Many soldiers were returning home after the war with injuries and disabilities. According to the Soldiers Settlement Act, most received free land and money. They also received government pensions. Aboriginal veterans, on the other hand, were excluded from these standard benefits. The Royal Canadian Legion acknowledged this unfairness experienced by Aboriginal veterans. It passed the following resolution: that the Indian War veteran be placed on the same footing and receive the same benefits as his other Canadian comrades, especially in regard to the Last Post Fund, Pensioners' Relief, and Veterans Allowance, and that the Canadian Legion, British Empire Service League, do everything in their power to bring this about. As you can see so far, the Aboriginal peoples were denied many of their rights, but in the last case, the Royal Canadian Legion fought for Aboriginal rights. Over time, the Aboriginals were receiving more and more rights, and this trend will mostly continue throughout the documentary. At the beginning of the 1920s, the way of life of Canada's Native peoples continued to be eroded by government and social policy. Ceremonies like the potlatch and the Sundance were still banned, and Native children were taken away from their homes to be educated in residential schools run by governments or religious organizations. Anything that was connected to Native language or heritage was excluded from school life in an effort to assimilate the younger generation into the mainstream of Canadian life. Other policies guaranteed that Native peoples would be dependent on a federal government that limited their freedom and followed policies of assimilation. If Native peoples lived on reserves, they were not allowed to vote. When they tried to take steps towards greater independence, they found government resistance. Amendments to the Indian Act in 1920 gave the Department of Indian Affairs the right to ban traditional forms of native government. An independence movement among the Six Nations of Grand River, Ontario, was strongly resisted by the Canadian government. In the early 1920s, Six Nations chief Descade took his case for self-government to both the British government and the League of Nations, the new international peacekeeping body. Although embarrassed by the international attention, Ottawa refused to give in. In 1924, the Department of Indian Affairs imposed an elective council on the Six Nations. Their traditional hereditary council was banned, and women who had played a role in selecting chiefs in the past lost their power. Other Native leaders tried to form united Native organizations to protect themselves and to gain rights. In British Columbia, Native bands led by Reverend Peter Kelly, a Haida, and Andrew Paul, a Squamish, formed the Allied Tribes of British Columbia to defend their lands and fishing areas and hunting rights. The organization disbanded in 1927. The struggle was quickly taken up by the Native Brotherhood of British Columbia, but many rights were still lost. Our next event takes place in the Dirty Thirties. It was called the Dirty Thirties because at that time people were going through a harsh economic downturn. Before this period, the Aboriginal peoples already had a difficult time. When this period came, it became even harder for the Aboriginal peoples. At that time, relief was given to the people there. Relief authorities tended to assume that all Native peoples could live off the land. This may have been true for some groups and individuals, but others had long abandoned a hunting and gathering economy. Moreover, in the prairie provinces, Native peoples were sometimes prosecuted when they tried to live off the land. These provinces had claimed jurisdiction over natural resources in 1930. Ignoring Aboriginal traditions and Native rights under federal law, the prairie provinces began to charge Native peoples who hunted and fished on government property. Looking at all this, I think it's safe to say that out of all the cultural groups within Canada, The one group that felt the sting of intolerance the most was the natives. They had a rough time, but things will start to be a little better for them pretty soon. In 1946, the federal government created a committee made up of members of the House of Commons and the Senate to consider changes to the Indian Act. In the hearings, which lasted until 1948, the committee learned of the difficulties that many Aboriginal peoples faced. Aboriginal incomes were often a fraction of those of other Canadians, and living conditions on reserves were often appalling, resulting in much lower health standards. For the first time, Native leaders were given an opportunity to put their concerns to the government. In 1951, these leaders succeeded in having some changes made to the Indian Act, giving Native peoples more personal rights, such as the right to perform ceremonies that had been made illegal earlier in the century. Tribal leaders were also given more control over decisions on the reserves, although the Indian Affairs Department could overrule their decision. As time progressed, many Canadians became aware of the unemployment, ill health, and poverty that was common at many native reserves. Moreover, government policies sometimes appeared harmful to native peoples. In one case, the Ojibwa of Grassy Narrows in Ontario had been forced to relocate to a new reserve on the English Wabigoon River system. This reserve offered fewer economic opportunities than their old home. Fishing could be pursued on the river system, which was also their source for drinking water. The Ojibwe, however, discovered that the river was highly polluted with mercury from a pulp and paper plant. The community's industry and health were ruined. In the late 1960s, Native leaders made it clear that traditional rights, for example to hunt and fish year-round, and land claims had to be top priority for the federal government. Yet in 1969, the Trudeau government prepared a policy document known as a white paper that ignored these priorities. Trudeau recommended measures designed to achieve integration and equality with other Canadians. Just as he opposed Quebec independence, Trudeau opposed the isolation of Native peoples from the rest of Canada. The White Paper proposed the elimination of the Department of Indian Affairs, Indian status, traditional rights, and treaty rights. The overwhelmingly hostile response by Native peoples marked a turning point in Native rights. Native peoples founded new organizations to protest more effectively. The Native Indian Brotherhood, NIB, was founded to represent status Indians. The Native Council of Canada was created to represent non-status Indians and Métis. The Indian Association of Alberta issued its own red paper in response to Trudeau's white paper. It also called for political and economic power at the community level, and for millions of dollars of spending to provide Native peoples with social services that equaled those provided to the rest of Canada. The report stated that Native peoples needed to be designated as Citizens Plus. The reaction of Native organizations caused Trudeau's government to withdraw the White Paper in 1971. During the rest of the 1970s, the federal government funded programs to support communication, cultural activities, and local government initiatives among Native peoples. As well, the government created the Indian Claims Commission in 1969 and the Office of Native Claims in 1974 to deal with the issue of land rights. Yet overall, in the 1970s, the federal government was less generous in spending on the Native peoples than on the general population. Dissatisfied with the government's minimal policies, the NIB, renamed the Assembly of First Nations in the 1980s, stepped up its media and lobbying efforts. As well, other organizations appeared and took on more active roles. For example, the Canadian Indian Youth Council, the Canadian Native Communication Society, and the National Native Women's Association of Canada. Over time, the Aboriginals were treated more and more fairly. Today, they have the same rights as any other Canadian.